Hey, Wellness Warriors, welcome to the Wellness Revolution. I'm your host, Dr. Milan Riobe, and today we're exploring the biology of boundaries and burnout, how HRV predicts your ability to say no. Did you know that 59% of millennials and even more percentages of Gen Z say that they're exhausted all the time? Not just physically exhausted, but mentally and emotionally exhausted as well. Today we're going to explore one of the root causes, which is the inability to set healthy boundaries and just say no sometimes. I always love to hear the anecdote that no is a complete sentence. And somehow I kind of knew that even as a kid. That was one of my favorite words to say. And little did I know at the time that it would serve me later in life. But setting healthy boundaries, or the absence of setting healthy boundaries, is a massive cause of burnout. And while it may seem simple to just say no, there's so many potential repercussions of that one little word that it sets people off on these tangents and going around in circles for sometimes decades before they understand that sometimes saying no is actually saying yes. Saying yes to who? Yourself. It turns out that we are the only ones who know what we're thinking, and we can't know what anyone else is thinking, no matter what they say or how they act. And so, our one and only barometer when it comes to setting boundaries is ourselves. And we're going to dive deep into this today so that you can learn to say no guilt free and get yourself out of burnout and set healthy boundaries. So, in our current lifestyle of this 24/7 go, go, go hustle mentality, we've set a massive trap for ourselves that leads us straight down the pit of burnout. Now that we have little boxes that we can carry around with us that keep us connected to everyone and everything, whether we want to be connected to them or not, at all hours of the day and night, 7 days a week, while that may seem like a nice convenience to have, of course, I want to be able to get in touch with my kids if I need to, have them have the ability to get in touch with me if they need something, if there's an emergency, God forbid. The downside of that is everybody else has access to you as well. And in our modern day work environments, that can be a slippery slope to burnout. We're pressured to set notifications. We're pressured to respond to text messages right away. We're pressured even to respond to emails right away, whether it suits us or not in the given moment. Getting distracted wastes 20 minutes of your time. So if you're diligently at work at your desk and all of a sudden you get pinged with a Slack message, you've just wasted about 20 minutes of your time if you actually turn around and look at it. How do we handle this, right? What do we do to make sure that we're our most efficient and not burning the candle at both ends, right? We've all been dinged with that text message after work hours asking us to do things that we know deep down we're not supposed to be doing at that hour, right? And it's a choice. It becomes a choice as to whether or not we respond or not. Now, that doesn't mean that you ghost people, right? But that does mean that you set healthy boundaries and make sure that people understand when you're on and when you're off. And just that mere statement sometimes sends some of my clients into a near panic. They can't even imagine the idea of saying no, whether it's to a demanding boss who is far exceeding the number of hours that they said you'd be working, or if it's a social event. You want to be socially relevant, you want to stay connected with your friends. And so saying no to going out can sometimes feel so hard. It feels hard because it is hard until you get used to saying no. Now, that doesn't mean you don't socialize. It doesn't mean don't stay connected and you don't go out. But if it's on that night when you're feeling kind of tired and you know that you really would rather stay home, then saying no is about the best thing you can do because that's saying yes to you. And it turns out you're the only one who matters. Because if you aren't present with yourself, you can't be present with anyone else, whether it be your friends, your children, your boss, your parents. Doesn't matter. If you're not present with you, you're not present with anyone. The other modern day trap is the idea that we have to be perfect and overachieving. The idea that good enough just isn't good enough. This is something that one of my attending physicians used to say all the time is the enemy of good is better. And we saw these examples sometimes when we were trying to be too perfect with how we were controlling blood loss in the surgical field, when we were training to become surgeons. And so every little drop of blood, like we would want to stop it. We would want to make sure that the patient wasn't bleeding before you sewed them back up. And we had to learn the hard way that not all bleeding is the same, and that it didn't matter if they were oozing a little bit, as long as their coagulation system was working, they would be fine. And so sometimes we'd get into trouble chasing after that last bit of blood, throwing that suture in, thinking you're going to stop more bleeding. And the opposite actually would happen, where you would actually put the needle in a blood vessel and actually cause more bleeding for that patient that you were trying to prevent bleeding in. And so we learned that the enemy of good is actually better. And so we learned that good enough was actually good enough. And that patient did well, and in fact lost less blood if you didn't try to stop every single drop of blood that you saw in the surgical field. But this is something I actually took with me throughout the rest of my life. And so the idea of perfectionism, the idea of needing to get straight A's, for example, needing to have that certain GPA, because if you don't have that certain GPA, you might feel guilty that your parents would be disappointed. And you might disappoint yourself because you placed expectations on yourself that you weren't able to meet. And you might be embarrassed, right? The risk of embarrassment when your colleagues are doing better than you, right? We learn to compare ourselves. And this is what the grading system in school does, right? It teaches us that comparison is important. It forgets to teach us that our uniqueness is equally as important. And while you may not be that straight A student, you may have profound gifts in other areas that don't get developed through the education system. And so we start to feel like we're not good enough. We start to feel that we need to try harder and become more and more and more perfect at the things that maybe we don't love so much. And that creates a lot of guilt. It leads to a lot of expectations that we can't meet, because if you're doing something you don't love, you'll never meet those expectations. And so then we grow up, right? We become adults and we take these things with us. We take these indoctrinations with us. We take these teachings with us, and then we apply it knowingly or unknowingly to all of our relationships in the workplace, in friendships, in group and community settings. And then we wonder why we're exhausted and burnt out. And the reason is because we're going against our uniqueness. We're going against who we really actually are. We're not meant to be perfect, but our society tells us that we are, and that there's something wrong with us if we're not. And this is what millions and millions of millennials and Gen Z unfortunately heard growing up, whether it was from their parents or their grandparents or teachers or religious figures or any number of other authority figures. And we learned that the consequences are dire if we're not perfect, right? We won't get that promotion. We won't make enough money. We won't be able to survive. We won't get that perfect partner. And we very quickly buy into these notions before we even know what's going on. And so a lot of burnout resolution is unwinding all that dogma and really kind of unburying yourself so that you get to know like who you actually are and who you were meant to be in the world so that you can be that. So what is the biology of that? So again, we talk about this a lot, but stress dictates biology, and stress actually hijacks our biology. Knowing the biology of that and how it interacts with your nervous system is extremely important. So our nervous system has two divisions. The one we're going to talk about today is called the autonomic nervous system. And it has two branches, the parasympathetic branch, which is the one that we want to be in most of the time, and the sympathetic branch, which is the fight or flight branch, or the good stress branch, we'll call it. These two sides of this one system can't be on at the same time. And so we're either sending signals to start our fight or flight branch or the sympathetic branch, or we're sending a signal to the parasympathetic branch, which is our calm side of the autonomic nervous system. So what ties that biology together in a way that we can actually see and know how it's interacting with our biology is our heart rate variability, or HRV. So what disrupts our HRV? There are several things that can do that. Of course, stress is one, but what does that stress look like, right? We can say the word stress and toss it around quite a bit, and we need some real life examples to know, like, well, what does that mean? It means getting a text message outside of work hours. It means being expected to work 2 and 3 hours over your expected time for the day. It means taking yourself out in a social situation when you're exhausted and don't really want to go. It means not getting enough sleep because, again, maybe that workload is too heavy and you're not setting good boundaries with either your other team members or with your management team. Or maybe it's not getting that help for the sleep issue that you're having. Maybe you're struggling to fall asleep or stay asleep. All of these things will drive our HRV down. So, what does HRV actually mean, and why is it so important to the autonomic nervous system? HRV stands for heart rate variability. When we look at our smartwatches or other biometric devices and we look for our heart rate, we're given one number. We're told, for example, that our pulse is 72 or our heart rate is 72 beats per minute. And that gives people the false impression that your heart rate is always the same, beat after beat. But that's not true. What that is an average heart rate. So when we take your pulse, we might measure how many beats we feel within a 15-second time frame and then multiply that by 4 to get the number of beats per minute. So if I count 15 beats or pulses in your heart rate during that 15-second time frame, I'll multiply that by 4 and I'll say your heart rate's 60. But that's not actually true. But if I could do that for each one of your actual heartbeats and figure out what the heart rate is for that one beat and look at the next beat and see what that heart rate is, I would see that they're different. And we can actually measure that. We can measure the amount of variability from one beat to the next beat. And it turns out that that really actually matters, maybe even more so than the actual average heart rate. So what we should see when we're looking at our heart rate is that it's kind of bouncy. It bounces around quite a bit. The more it bounces around, the better. So we should see, for example, that if we were to measure your heart rate for one of your beats and it was 62 beats per minute, that the next one should be 20 beats higher, should be like 82 beats per minute. And then it should bounce up and down like that, from 72 to 90, down to 68, up to 88 or so. While you don't feel that variability from beat to beat and it feels fairly smooth, it's happening so quickly and so smoothly that we don't feel it. But that's because of how your nervous system is constantly interacting with the signals from your body. So there's this constant exchange back and forth between the environment and your body and the nervous system that dictates your actual heart rate. And that is heart rate variability. Good heart rate variability, we're going to see wild swings, like we said, like 20 beats per minute per beat. When heart rate variability is narrow, we'll see that the change is only, like, say, 4 beats or 5 beats per minute per beat. That's not a safe place to stay, because that tells us that your nervous system is dysregulated, that you're in fight or flight more than you should be, and that the sympathetic nervous system is activated more than it should be. Turns out that this is dangerous in the long term. So we're starting to see correlations between well-being and heart rate variability to the point where heart rate variability is essentially being accepted as a vital sign, and perhaps even more important, like I said before, than your actual pulse. And there are many factors that go into heart rate variability because your body is constantly surveilling, it's constantly receiving input of data, and it's constantly processing that data. And there's information going back and forth to your brain. And that's also, again, inherently involved with your breath, as we talked about many, many times. Breathing is the simplest, quickest way to increase heart rate variability. While it's one of the most important factors and one of the easiest ways to intervene to increase heart rate variability, it's not the only factor. It turns out that how you eat, how you move and exercise, how you sleep, and when you sleep, as well as how your body removes toxins from itself, also dictate your heart rate variability. Studies have shown that a diet of processed food and pro-inflammatory foods lowers heart rate variability. We see studies also that show that a healthier so-called anti-inflammatory diet actually increases heart rate variability. And I put that in air quotes only because It depends on the person. What's anti-inflammatory for one person may actually be inflammatory for someone else, depending on your dynamic metabolic type. When I say inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, I mean for your specific dynamic metabolic type. So for example, if you're a cold deficient dynamic metabolic type, and again, you're eating a lot of cold, raw, frozen food, that's actually going to be more inflammatory, even though it's a raw vegan diet, which we would think should be anti-inflammatory. Someone who's a hot deficient, who's having more raw food, that's going to balance them. And so that's going to balance inflammation and be anti-inflammatory for them. So it always depends. Studies show that anti-inflammatory diets help increase your heart rate variability. Also sleep deprivation or insomnia directly lowers heart rate variability according to studies. There was one study on mercury toxicity. The higher the mercury levels in the body, the lower the heart rate variability seemed to be. So that seemed to suggest that other heavy metals can also impact heart rate variability and consequently impact the biology that is being sent into your body that is informing your metabolism and how you perform your body functions. So why am I saying all this? So it turns out that your heart rate variability actually determines whether or not you're able to say no and set healthy boundaries. So studies are also showing this to be true. So sometimes, again, we hear the idea of, well, just set boundaries for yourself and don't let anyone cross them, right? And it sounds simple, but people with low heart rate variability can't do that. It's almost physiologically impossible for them to do it. Whereas people with high heart rate variability find it a lot easier to set healthy boundaries and enforce them. And this is the critical difference, and this is why it's so important to work on yourself, right? To work on how am I breathing? What am I eating? Is what I'm eating suitable to my dynamic metabolic type? Is it helping my biology or is it harming my biology? Is it helping me to regulate my nervous system properly or is it harming my nervous system? How is my exercise doing as well? Is that helping or harming my heart rate variability? Over-exercising can backfire. It can actually drop your heart rate variability. And I've seen this quite a bit too. Long distance runners is a great example where they come in and they're doing what they believe and what should be all the right things, right? We think that staying active and eating right and sleeping and doing all these things should help our overall health. But I'll often have people come in and they'll say, I feel terrible. And when I ask them what their exercise is, and they're long distance runners, and they happen to have a deficient dynamic metabolic type, I'll ask them, like, do you have a biometrics device like an Apple Watch or something that tells you your heart rate variability? If they say yes, I'll ask them to take a peek at it. And inevitably, their heart rate variability tends to be fairly low or average. Oftentimes, we'll see that it's the mismatch of their activity with their dynamic metabolic type that's the issue. So often I have to ask them to not run and do something that's much more restorative for some time while we work on eliminating that dynamic metabolic type so that we bring that back to balance. And then they can slowly begin to increase their exercises again, but always making sure that they don't slip back into the deficient dynamic metabolic type status. Otherwise, they slip back into burnout. And very often, those same people have difficulty with setting boundaries. So when we talk about their work experience, whether they're self-employed or working for others, we often see that they're burning the candle at both ends. And no matter how hard they try to rein that in, they feel so inefficient with their work that they feel like they have to put more and more and more hours in. That's because they're too deficient. Making sure that we improve metabolism, improve that nervous system regulation so that they can increase their heart rate variability, then it becomes much simpler for them to start creating those boundaries and saying no to those difficult clients that they don't want to take on, saying no to the overly demanding boss, or saying no to the social events that take them well outside of their comfort zone due to their fatigue. And the interesting thing I'll find also is when I do follow-ups with clients, the ones that are doing their heart rate variability work are the ones that are seeing the most progress. The ones that still feel like they're in chaos and they're not doing well, they're usually the ones that aren't working on heart rate variability. And so it takes some convincing at first because it feels like another thing I have to go do on top of the thousands of things I already have to do every day. But the miracle is how much more efficient you become when your nervous system is properly regulated, when your biology is functioning properly, which means your metabolism is functioning properly. You literally buy back time. I see this over and over and over again. And then all of a sudden the light bulbs go off where you ask yourself, like, yeah, why am I doing that thing I'm not supposed to be doing? Or why am I going out until 3 o'clock in the morning when I really don't want to? And then they start to rein that in, and then they just start feeling better and better and better. And then they get to make better choices for themselves so that it's a win-win and not a win-lose. I had a young lady come in who was a teacher, and she was just exhausted. She loved her job. She loved the kids that she worked with, but she was being asked to do too much. She was being asked to do things after school and really being stretched way beyond what her dynamic metabolic type could withstand. She was a cold deficient dynamic metabolic type. A deficient dynamic metabolic type is someone who doesn't have the metabolism to support the energetic demands being placed on them. We worked hard on heart rate variability. We worked on getting her 4 pillars up and running, right? Her eat pillar, which was pretty good. The only thing that was missing from her nutrition was that she was eating foods that were cold as well. So she was eating salads and raw foods, having smoothies that had ice in them. And that was actually backfiring for her cold deficient dynamic metabolic type. Because when you add cold to cold, you get colder, right? You get imbalanced even more. And she was getting more and more exhausted and inflamed and depleted because her eat pillar was not balanced for her dynamic metabolic type. So we just made a minor tweak. It wasn't too hard for her to do, but we just asked her to make sure everything was cooked. We asked her to make broths and put those veggies in the broth instead of having it as a cold salad. We asked her to do broths in the morning instead of that shake and have a room temperature protein shake or room temperature smoothie, which helped her to balance her eat pillar for her dynamic metabolic type. We did the same thing with her exercise. She liked to do a lot of long distance running as well. So we asked her to back down off of that and do things that were more restorative. Again, we tell people this is not a life sentence. It's just for a while until we get you back to balance. And then we just need to make sure that you stay in balance as you start increasing your activities, right? So she did. She stopped running and she started doing things that were more consistent with where her body was. So she was doing more walking, more biking, and not like spin class biking, but just leisure biking, and that was really great for her. And then sleep. We asked her to get an extra hour of sleep beyond what she was doing, which meant she couldn't do that after school activity anymore. And so she had to find another teacher to take her place, but she was able to kind of scale back and confine her work activities to the hours that she could tolerate. And then detoxification took care of itself because we rebalanced the eat pillar and we slowed down her exercise. So her body was able to more efficiently remove toxins and she became less inflamed. And so she started to feel much better just from that. And of course, we asked her to do heart math, which we ask all of our clients to do because it's such a critical means to raise that heart rate variability. So when you have your 4 pillars cranking, it's much easier to raise your heart rate variability with your heart math breathing. If you're doing your heart math breathing, but you see that your heart rate variability is not improving, that's a sign that there's something going on in one of your 4 pillars. Either that your eat pillar is off, so you might be eating all the right foods, but maybe you're not absorbing that food. So I've had other examples of people who started eating properly, but they still weren't feeling well. That was our first sign that they weren't absorbing the food into their body. So we were able to do testing to clarify that and correct that so that they could absorb what they were doing. And that helped them to balance their pillar for their dynamic metabolic type. If you see that your heart rate variability is not responding to what you're doing, that's a sign that something a little bit deeper is going on that needs a little bit of extra attention. So going back to my client who was the teacher, she was horrified at the idea of disappointing her students by not being the one to lead that after school activity. And so guilt was driving a lot of her decisions. And that guilt came from not just her role as a teacher, but of course, her early life roles as well, as a child, as a student herself. So these are the things we carry with us. This is the dogma that we should feel guilty if we're not nurturing other people first, if we're not putting other people before ourselves. We're often labeled as selfish. And while we think kids forget stuff, they don't. They may not be able to recall it. If you were to ask them, hey, you remember that time that, I don't know, we'll make up your teacher called you selfish. Do you remember that time? Most people will say, no, I don't remember that at all. But the brain remembers it. It just can't piece it back together as that story again, but it remembers it on a subconscious level. And that is interacting with every choice you make moving forward in your life. Unless you identify it, realize that it's not true, and then correct it. So, of course, there should be no guilt in saying no when it's an appropriate no. And yet, subconsciously, many of us walk around with that anchor. Whenever someone asks us to do something, we remember when we were a kid and we were called selfish. Although we can't recall it in the moment, it's informing whether or not we say yes or no in this moment. And that's what really matters. If your heart rate variability is low, you're more likely to give in and say yes when you should say no. If your heart rate variability is high, you're more likely to be able to snap out of it and say, you know what, I'm overcommitted at the moment. Thank you for understanding. And again, we should never apologize for saying no. An apology implies that, again, you feel like you're doing something wrong. And so I've learned not to apologize, but instead thank people in advance for understanding my position. And so I coach a lot of my students the same way. So high heart rate variability gives us courage. Courage means heart, gives us heart. It's really fascinating how play on words come in. The idea of courage means heart. And in fact, the French word for heart is cœur. So people will often ask me, well, how do I know if I should say yes or no in the moment? One thing is you can always buy time and say, you know what, give me a couple days to think about that and I'll get back to you. And then during that time, you ask yourself, do I want to do X or do I not want to do X? And your heart actually answers you. So in addition to having heart rate variability, the heart also contains our intuition. And intuition is on the brink of being scientifically proven through the use of quantum computing and AI. There are also particles that have been detected, one of which is called Zeta 9. And it's a particle that's active in the ethers before we are consciously aware of a decision that we're making. And so the little hints of consciousness and intuition are out there and they're starting to materialize. But of course, ancient traditions have been telling us about intuition and our soul, how our soul speaks to us for millennia. So what I advise people to do is to sit in stillness. When you get home and it's nice and quiet, turn off all the racket, turn down the lights, sit in stillness. If you want to do it in the lotus position or laying flat, however you want to do it. The point is for it to be fairly dark in your room and quiet. And for you to really breathe, heart math is a great way to get very centered in your body very quickly. And again, for those who don't remember, it's a very slow 5-second inhale, followed by a very slow 5-second exhale, always through your nostrils. So you never hold your breath and you never breathe through the mouth while you're doing this technique. It very quickly centers you. The reason for that is because your lungs are triangular or bell-shaped, and they're much wider at the bottom than at the middle or at the top. So when you drive a deep breath down to the very bottom of your lung, you're actually flooding the body with oxygen. When you flood the body with oxygen, it knows itself to be safe. And so the parasympathetic system is instantly turned on, the calm side of the nervous system. The other thing about the lungs that's fascinating is when you take air in, it's going down one tube until it gets to the level of your heart, and then it splits in two to go into each of your lungs. If you're paying attention when you breathe, you actually feel like a dispersal of air right around your heart when you're breathing. When we're told to breathe into our hearts, that's actually what we're doing. When we feel the awareness, when we sense the awareness of that little poof of air that happens when the air splits into the two bronchi that go into each lung. And so that's a very quick way to center yourself into your body. then you simply ask, is doing that after school activity in my best and highest good? And just listen. If you feel a little bit of a heart sinking, then the answer is no. If you feel your heart perk up and you feel a little bit of heat in your heart or a feeling of being raised up, then that's your intuition giving you the thumbs up to go ahead. But you have to be still. If you let your brain intervene, you're going to get the wrong answer. And also know that circumstances change, right? It might be the right thing this week, but not 2 months from now. So while there may be certain things that the universe wants to put in place during those 2 months before it extracts you out of that situation, there's a purpose for it, right? So there was a purpose to my client having that after school activity for those several months, even though she knew that it was wearing her down. She may have been very well centered and very clear that she wanted to do it in the beginning, but then circumstances changed, and then the answer changed. It wasn't a yes anymore, it became a no. And that's okay. I've learned the hard way sometimes that just because something is right when you start it doesn't mean it stays right the whole time. And we have to be comfortable in not feeling guilty about commitment. Like, I made this commitment to this thing, so I can't quit. If the thing is no longer the thing you started and it's no longer a match for you, then it's not quitting. It's politely moving on to the next thing that is appropriate for you and allowing that situation to get a better match too. So it's a win-win. It's not that you're winning by leaving and you're leaving them at a loss. The universe doesn't like vacuums. It's going to have a win-win for everyone as long as the intention is good from the beginning. So we often don't see that side of things, right? Because when we leave the job or we leave whatever circumstance that we're leaving, we don't get to see what's going on there after we've left. So we make this assumption that it must be bad. And it's not true because we don't even know. We're just making an assumption. So again, the only barometer you have is you. You don't know what that circumstance is going to do to rectify itself, and you can't know. Even if they were to tell you what they were going to do, it doesn't mean that's what they're doing. So the only barometer is you. Your inner compass is the only thing you can use to know if something is appropriate for you or not. And so saying no is sometimes the right thing to do if that's what your heart tells you to do. And then having the faith and the courage to know that even if it doesn't feel good in the moment, right? None of us like to leave a circumstance where we think that people are not going to be served if we leave, or something's going to fall apart if we leave. None of us like that feeling. But sometimes you have to swim through a raging river to get to the other side. And it takes two to tango. The circumstance that you're leaving or changing also has to kind of pick up and make its own decisions and see what's right for itself, having nothing to do with you. And so knowing that, okay, if I swim through this raging river and I get to the other side, things will be better. I'll dry off, dust myself off, and keep moving. But if your heart rate variability is too low, you won't want to dive into that river. If your heart rate variability is high, you'll be ready to dive in head first. That's what the science is suggesting. So our lifestyle, how we breathe, how we eat, how we move, how we rest, and how we detox is so critically important to heart rate variability and decision making, and having the courage to involve our heart in all of our decisions and take our brain out, because your heart has its own brain. We call it heart brain, and that is in fact what creates that heart rate variability in the heart. So you want to use our heart brain and not our head brain when we're making decisions. Now, obviously, we involve our head brain to do our work and to remember things and to move about in the world. So it's not that we're, cutting our heads off and just using our hearts all the time. But we do want to make grounded decisions that are heart-based and then involve the brain later. So we just want to delay the brain because the ego comes in and it's always opposite to what your heart wants to do, because it remembers all the things that we heard as kids from authoritative figures that led us down the path of burnout to begin with, right? So it always wants to default there. So you want to make sure that we're still. That's part of the stillness and getting centered in your body, is so you can delay the brain's ego coming at you and changing your mind. Now, of course, this takes practice. So you want to center yourself as often as you need to reaffirm that you're making the right decisions. So it's not a one and done. It's constantly coming back to center, constantly coming back to yourself. And a decision that you make on a Monday may not be the same decision you make on a Friday, and that's okay. And again, we have to balance that with not being completely uncommitted as well, right? So there's always a balance. So if they told you that you would be working from 9 to 5 and a 40-hour work week, and all of a sudden by the end of week one, you've worked 80 hours and you decide you don't want to go back, it's not a bad decision, right? Now, of course, you want to balance that decision with, well, what am I going to do in the meanwhile? Is there another position for me? Do I want to take some time off? Do I have the funds to take some time off? Is this a position that I can fill elsewhere? And do I have something to bridge me in between, right? So you want to make those logical types of decisions as well, but don't let the fear keep you in a space that you shouldn't be in. And again, the cycle of guilt is like an anchor, an anvil. We feel guilty if we don't say yes, whether it's to a friend, a parent, even a child, or a coworker, a boss, a manager. Guilt is a form of fear, where we make ourselves the bad person for not doing what the other person needed us to do. When we say yes when we mean no, that sets up resentment, frustration, anger, and all the other fear-based emotions, right? So that one fear becomes 10 other fears and they feed off of each other, and that creates the vicious cycle of burnout from not setting proper boundaries. When we say yes when we mean no, that triggers the nervous system to, again, have that low heart rate variability by triggering the sympathetic side or the fight or flight side of our nervous system more than it should be. And again, that causes us to blow through resources that we don't really have to spare, especially with all this modern day stress that we're living in. So conserving our good, valuable energy is really important. And if we're saying yes out of guilt and setting up the low heart rate variability that then consumes so much energy, we get exhausted. We get emotionally exhausted, physically exhausted, mentally exhausted. And that's burnout. And that's a vicious cycle because that keeps your heart rate variability low, and that makes you less and less and less able to say no when you need to. So putting yourself first is extremely important. I can't emphasize that enough. Love yourself first, and you'll be there for everybody else who needs you. Put yourself last, and you're going to be burnt out and unable to really fully be present. You might be there, you might physically be there, but you won't be present in your body. You'll be present, I'm here, but not present, I'm engaged. And that's really important. So some tips and tricks are to make sure that you are centering yourself on at least once a day, bare minimum, for 3 minutes. If you can do it 3 times a day, even better. And of course, there's no limit. You can do it more than that if you wish. But being centered and heart-centered is so important. I can't even stress it enough. Tip number 2, once you have your heart rate variability higher, making sure that you set those healthy boundaries. You might set your calendar for going offline at a certain time and finding perhaps some time in nature or doing a little meditation or even taking a nap. Or instead of going out, invite a friend over and just kind of hang out. Like you don't have to have a dinner party or drink or do anything like that. Maybe just have a friend over and just spend some good quality time. But whatever you do during that 4-hour reset block, make sure it's for you. Tip number 3 is choose a time after which you will not be checking emails. And if you need to announce that, then announce it. Or if you can just do it silently, do that as well. But decide for yourself, when is the last hour of the day that I'm going to check messages from other people? And stick to it. Tip number 4, emotional boundaries. Avoiding toxic friendships, relationships, whether they be at work or at home with friends, is extremely important. We are made of energy, and we're constantly exchanging energy with other people. The energy field of our heart is not confined inside of us. It's actually 8, 11 feet out, maybe even further than that. We're not really quite sure yet. So we're always interacting with other people's energy fields. And if they have low heart rate variability and they're stressed out, that will spill into your field, especially if you also have low heart rate variability. Setting those clear emotional boundaries so you can politely tell that person that you love them and care about them, but that you're protecting your own energy and you feel easily overwhelmed by other people's stress, and politely ask them to steer the conversation in a different direction. Maybe watch a funny movie or comedy or something light together instead. Or if you know the person intimately enough, politely suggest a therapist for them to unpack their stress. Again, always with love and with care, and always a win-win. And if that person is offended, again, making sure that you don't feel guilty for stepping up and stepping into your own boundaries. And if that person is offended, it's important not to take that in. It's important not to feel guilty for setting healthy boundaries. Again, if you know in your heart that it's the right thing for you to say and do, then be okay with that and understand that sometimes it's not you. And sometimes that's the biggest favor that you can do for someone else, although they may not see it at the beginning. And my last tip is time boundaries. Again, we alluded to this earlier, where you set a block of time on your calendar every day, where you protect your rest, make sure that you can get appropriate amount of sleep, make sure that you eat. That's really important. Again, in today's go, go, go society, I have clients who forget to eat. They think that if they don't put those hours in, they're not going to be able to get that promotion or get the raise that they're looking for. But if you don't feed your body, you won't be able to efficiently do your work, and it'll show. So take the 30 minutes to make sure that you eat properly. And that might require a little bit of planning where you're packing your lunch or you know exactly where you're going to go get your food. So make sure you kind of scour the area and know where all the good places are where you can get a good, light, healthy meal for lunch. And then do the same for dinner, where you're eating a fairly light but substantially nutritious dinner. And schedule that in too. But it doesn't mean that everything's going to be simple and you're just going to make a decision and everything's going to flow. There will be bumps in the road, and that's okay. Just make sure you keep coming back to it, again, without the guilt, no self-blame. We're just all readjusting to how we should have been living all along. And so it's a journey for all of us. Trust me, I've been in burnout as well. No one's life is perfect. We all have bumps in the road, but every day that you make a choice for yourself is a win. And for clients with children, especially smaller children, I recommend that if you have a parent who can watch them for a couple of hours or a trusted sitter, or if you can engage them in an activity where it's still restful for you, but they're also engaged. Kids love heart math. They love to watch their heart rate variability go up and down. And so it's a really engaging thing. It's almost like a game to them. And so they really do actually enjoy it. And so I've encouraged a lot of my clients to have their kids do it as well, which is a big help. So just to recap, boundaries are a burnout prevention tool, not just a productivity hack. So ask yourself, where am I saying yes when I really want to say no? And really ask from your heart. Get yourself centered, do your breathing for a few minutes, and then really ask yourself and start to put what you would prefer out into the universe. What would be your preference? And how would that be a win-win? And get imaginative with it. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Not just, oh, I hate this job, I want to change it. What does the new one look like? What does it feel like? What are you doing in your day? Do you have time to eat? Do you have time to sleep? Do you have time to do all the things you love? Do you love your coworkers? Do you love your boss? What does that feel like? And play with that and keep going back to that until it actually happens. And then as you're seeing those slow incremental changes, acknowledge yourself for having done so. When you see that heart rate variability go up higher than where it was before, acknowledge yourself, acknowledge that you just did that, and know that that's just the beginning. When you make that first choice for yourself and you say no, and you don't feel guilty about it, acknowledge that. That's really important. And again, we're not punishing anyone by saying no. It's always done with respect. It's always done with love and care, but it's a win-win and not a win-lose. So I hope you got value out of this podcast. Start setting those amazing boundaries for yourself. Get yourself out of burnout and thrive and live your best life now. If you haven't yet taken our burnout assessment, the link's in the description. I encourage you to take it. You'll get a customized report in your inbox guiding you with your dynamic metabolic type and how to apply that to your 4 pillars of wellness. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget, our 7-day burnout resolution challenge is coming up at the end of May for our subscribers. If you're interested in our corporate burnout resolution programs, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share our corporate burnout risk assessment tool with you and discuss how you can get your team members out of burnout so that you can have a thriving corporation and team members. As always, thanks for listening. And until next time, many, many blessings.